What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for RoboCop Rogue City in what I assure you is an incredibly timely review and definitely not 2 years late. In all seriousness though, I was playing this because I got it for super cheap during the Steam Autumn sale and it seemed like a fun way to break up a slate of RPG reviews and things I was going to have to get deep into, and this honestly just looked like some silly fun, and that is what I needed in the moment, which is why I'm finally getting around to reviewing it. Now, normally this is where I'd give you my usual spiel, but I feel like for this one we'll give it a pass, as I'm sure you guys know the drill by now. But as I already mentioned, I bought this for $6 on the Steam Autumn sale, and after hearing so many good things about it, it just seemed like a convenient way to play it. That said, 100% on this is not a difficult proposition. There's a few missable things that, as long as you're paying attention, are easy to grab on a first playthrough. You can also New Game Plus and try out a couple things as well, if you want to see like the different endings for individual characters, things like that. Simply put, very easy game to 100%. Though I did want to mention here towards the beginning as well that this game did relatively recently receive a standalone expansion called Unfinished Business. I'm not going to be covering that here. The gist of it basically seems to be taking the primary gameplay of this, expanding it a little bit with things like new weapons and a couple experiences and stuff, and putting you at the forefront of taking down the criminal elements that are all comprised in a single building, known as the Omni Tower. Otherwise, let's get into it. So, RoboCop Rogue City is in fact a single-player first-person shooter, as you would probably imagine, and of course it takes place as part of the RoboCop franchise, and what that means specifically is that it takes place between the second and third movies. The original movie was released, I believe, in 1987, with the third one releasing in 1993, which is the year I was born, which I tell you because this is a franchise that certainly was before my time a little bit. But ironically, because it was around the time I was born, I do remember people watching it when I was younger, and in fact I have seen the movies, albeit an incredibly long time ago. And while having some knowledge of the movies I think can certainly enhance the experience here, because again it kind of happens in between the middle of 2 and 3, it's hardly required, and in fact I think you'll kind of get the gist of it even without having any familiarity with the franchise, because as what I would consider a AA title, it feels great running around kind of engaging in the sort of ultra-violence that is this dystopian look at a version of Detroit. Now, on top of the actual shooting and individual gameplay elements feeling pretty good and like it captures the essence of the franchise, there's also a surprising amount of like side content and investigations to get up to. Now, unfortunately, I do think that is coupled against main missions that kind of feel very on rails, kind of like a shooting gallery or one of those old arcade games where you're like kind of literally on rails as you shoot things that pop up. So it's certainly not perfect, but it is really fun. Now, first up, let's talk technical state. I didn't have any problems running this personally. Looking at relatively recent Steam reviews, a few people seem to have encountered some issues, but they don't seem to be particularly widespread. So more than likely, this game will run pretty well for you. Next up, difficulty and New Game Plus. So initially this game has 4 difficulties, basically easy, normal, hard, and extreme. However, once you beat the game the first time, you'll unlock New Game Plus, as well as an extra difficulty that comes with that, called There Will Be Trouble. Now, as the difficulty goes up, the more damage you take primarily, and it does adjust enemy health and stuff as well, but the main thing is that you're taking more damage. So the higher the difficulty, the more you need to first focus on survivability. But with New Game Plus, you can, of course, tackle the higher difficulties with a fully kitted out RoboCop, which basically means all your upgrades in this case, and on top of granting you a little bit of extra progression via some stuff we'll talk about, and the new difficulty, you can also use this as an opportunity to explore different parts of the story, basically, in terms of how you treat people, because that will affect the endings. Which brings us to the story section. So, as I mentioned, this particular game takes place between the second and third movies, and carries forward much of that plot, and in many ways kind of bridges the gap between them. So, while you don't need knowledge of those, it is once again a helpful thing to know, but either way, recently you have deposed the local drug lord, I believe his name was Kane. However, he seems to be replaced by a shadowy entity known as the New Guy in Town. or, what he's known by initially before you find out his actual identity, but your job is basically to initially shut down these drug operations that are continuing to operate, which then puts you on the trail of this mysterious entity, which unfolds into a larger political plot, unsurprisingly. Now, a decent portion of this revolves around the fact that the OCP, or the Omni Consumer Products Corporation, has effectively called in on some defaulted debts from the city of Detroit, granting them control over much of the public services, including things like the police department. This is why they are exerting so much control over what the police are doing specifically, and if you're familiar with the movies, you'll actually probably already know what's going on here in terms of that, but while I don't want to spoil the game if you happen to play it, again, if you've seen the movies, you kind of know where the plot is going, and honestly, with the original movie being from the 80s, the late 80s, 87, it's the kind of plot that I think fits right in with movies from that time, very over-the-top action that leads into some basic conspiracy stuff. It's not exactly like must-see or anything, but it's a decent story for the type of game this is, which I think is obviously the point. However, how that story ends is actually up to you. There are multiple endings, and much of that comes down to the people you support along the way. It's possible to get different people elected to mayor, as well as see different outcomes for a lot of the individual characters you run into along the way based on your responses and how you treated them and the decisions you made. Now, the sort of catch to that, and why I applaud them actually putting some choice and consequence here, is that a lot of those endings still have to fit into the canon of being between the second and third movies, if you will, so I wouldn't really expect it to deviate much from that. Nonetheless, though, I think they certainly did some things they didn't have to, and I had some fun messing around with it. Moving on from there to progression, however. So, progression is broken down into levels, skills, skill discs, some chipboards that will upgrade your Auto 9 pistol, and that's kind of the bulk of it. Basically, as you take out enemies, complete objectives, you'll earn levels. This earns you skill points that you can then spend on the game's various skills, of course. These do have actual impact on how you play the game. There are even some skill checks and things involving a few of these here and there. One of them will even highlight the best responses to do things like, get certain endings, that kind of thing. Or at least point you in the direction of the good versions of those endings, I guess. Engineering will help you crack safes instead of having to find the code, or Vitality will help you heal more easily. The final upgrade for that gives you a constant healing effect that is super helpful in the late battles. But basically the skills are divided into milestones, which give you very specific abilities to use in combat and stuff, or just passive helpful features, and at the same time they give you passive bonuses to just things across the board, like weapon damage, armor, that kind of thing. Pretty basic system overall. It's also possible to find OCP discs hanging around in the environment, usually in secret places. This will just grant you skill points outright. And at the end of every level, you'll get an evaluation, which will give you a bunch of experience, which is a great way to gain several levels at once. And then there's your pistol. So the game has 20 different weapons you can pick up, but you will always have your main sidearm, the Auto 9. This has infinite ammo, so you're probably going to be using it the most, especially because it is very customizable once you get a short ways into the story via these little chipboards you can pick up. That, with some chips you can earn from various chests and stuff throughout the game, you can more or less form little circuits on these boards while avoiding penalties and upgrade your weapon. This is going to give you things like increased magazine size, weapon damage, the usual stuff, but some of them actually can also grant you special fire modes like explosive bullets, or turning it into a shotgun when it hits an enemy, things like that. So there's different ways to customize this weapon, and as a result, and combined with the infinite ammo of the thing, you're almost certainly going to be using this substantially more than all of the other weapons you can pick up in the alternative slot. That's kind of the bulk of progression, though. Basically just improving your skills as a RoboCop. Probably worth a mention, though, that if you're not playing on super high difficulties, you'll probably want deduction first, because this can give you, at a maximum, a 30% XP boost, which is going to help you get all of those extra skills. And in fact, in using that on normal mode for my main run, you can unlock almost all of these skills in a single run. I think I had 2 of them not maxed out by the end. Now, on higher difficulties, that's a little more difficult to do, because those are easier if you lean into survivability first, so you're not just getting torn to shreds in firefights. But I suppose that is a personal preference. Next up, let's talk gameplay. So, gameplay in this one is interesting in the sense that it is a mix of like very linear story missions and even some side missions and stuff, on top of like fully explorable zones that have side quests and investigations and like police work you can have our RoboCop Alex Murphy here perform, which can come down to everything like simply using your RoboVision to scan for parking violations and issuing some tickets, all the way to like full-blown murder investigations. There's a couple of those. Those are fun to get into, but I will say a lot of that stuff has like a very clear path forward that's going to give you pretty much exactly the answers you're looking for, and some of your skills can make that easier for you certainly, but it's stuff that's pretty hard to mess up otherwise. And yet, it is still fun, I think, for this game to give you these larger explorable zones like the downtown area where you can actually like run through and interact with citizens and make some of those choices about how people see you. For instance, helping out citizens will help you with building public trust, which can affect the endings, things like that. So can simply upholding the law, or the letter of the law in this case as an example, and basically how you treat the city of Detroit does matter for things like the endings here and there, and that part was cool to see. There is, simply put, more than you would probably expect here at first glance, even if it's still not like a massive amount of content or anything. Outside of all those missions and stuff you can undertake, you can, of course, also find a whole bunch of loot, some of which I've described already, like the OCP discs or crime evidence, that kind of thing that you can pick up, and this can, of course, give you extra XP, and all of it really contributes to your overall mission rating, as the story itself being divided up into main missions, just with the explorable parts kind of peppered in. You'll ultimately get a rating at the end of it, and the more of this stuff you do, the better you will do. Now, a lot of these investigations and that side content basically comes down to activating RoboVision, which will then, of course, allow you to investigate and gather up the information you need to move forward. But there's not really like a wrong way to do this. You're not going to really come to like wrong conclusions or anything. You just find it, scan it, and it'll tell you where to go next. So not exactly complicated stuff, but it does feel appropriate for what the game is supposed to be. Especially when, inevitably, the over-the-top nature of this particular game rears its head and we're forced to enforce some street justice, which usually just means blowing everyone's head off. As a core feature, and this is where we're getting into the combat of this particular franchise, is a sort of level of ultra-violence that is so violent, it kind of verges on humorous, if that makes sense. Like, you know, where violence is so over the top to the point that it becomes ridiculous in its nature. That's kind of what RoboCop has always evoked for me personally, and this game is no exception. And I think it definitely works for the type of game they're building here. As a result, combat feels pretty great, even if it's not a terribly complicated system. The feedback of actually getting headshots and, watching heads explode and bodies fly, and then using RoboCop strength to pick up items and chuck them, be that explosives or just dumpsters, that kind of thing, or even other enemies that you can pick up and throw into enemies, causing all sorts of carnage. It's the exact sort of like over-the-top 80s action you would expect from exactly something like this, and it feels awesome. And it's helped by the fact that RoboCop feels like a walking tank for the most part, based on the difficulty a little bit, admittedly, but once you get your skills going especially, you are this walking juggernaut that is absolutely tearing everything around you to shreds, and by the end of this game, you will have killed potentially thousands of people. Narrative dissonance be damned. Unsurprisingly, though, this game is not really a cover-based shooter or anything, although you can certainly hide behind things on occasion, and as a result, you're going to take some hits, which is where that walking tank part comes in, but you're still going to have to restore your health. At the very maximum, Vitality will help you restore some of this manually, but there's also these items you can pick up, and you can carry more of them based on your skills as well that will heal you and keep you in shape, so you'll have to find some of those what amount to med kits scattered here and there, and then if you have a certain skill, you can also use junction boxes to restore your health as well, as you battle all sorts of different enemy types. Now, it is for the most part different types of humans based on the individual street gangs, like the street vultures or the splatterpunks, things like that. Some of them are riding motorcycles, you can even fight some snipers later, and eventually you'll get to a more high-tech militarized gang that is obviously more difficult to fight and actually has body armor and are less prone to being chewed up by you immediately. But those are hardly the only things, because we also get some abilities based on your skills. So some of those skills grant active abilities that you can use in combat. Shock wound up being at its full maximum, being incredibly strong. You can activate this shock that just kind of instantly kills a bunch of enemies around you, and that seemed to basically include everything that wasn't a boss enemy, which was obviously incredibly strong. But you can also grab things like a shield, which is like an 80% damage reduction for a time. There's a dash ability to help you move a little faster. You can slow down time, which happens sometimes automatically. Some missions where you're trying to like save hostages will see you breaking down a door, and then time slows as you have a moment to try to take out the enemies before they shoot the hostages, that kind of thing. But there's also an ability that will let you activate that slow motion whenever you want. So there is that. Now, beyond that stuff, as I mentioned, there are a whole host of other weapons you could theoretically pick up. There's just never really like a specific reason to use them in most cases. Like you can, on occasion, pick up some heavy guns and just like have fun with them. But once you start getting your Auto 9 upgrades and the fact that it has infinite ammo, there's really just not a reason to use the other weapons very often. So there's certainly that. Now, unfortunately, while actually churning your way through the regular enemies is really fun in a sort of power fantasy type of way, the boss fights are a bit of a different story. The proper boss fights, I didn't really like any of them. I think they used the same boss a couple times in a row, and they are just incredible bullet sponges where your job is to basically just try to take as little damage as possible while absolutely unloading clip after clip into these things, and even with throwing stuff at them or hitting their weak spots, it just takes forever. So the boss fights are, frankly, a little uninspired. Simple enough system, but it feels really good to play, and that's obviously going to matter a lot in a game like this where gameplay is a big part of it, and it's just honestly really fun, and I think that is probably why this game landed as well as it did for so many people, on top of all the little details about RoboCop that it gets right. Which brings me to the Steam Deck section. So, officially speaking, this game is playable on the Steam Deck with a rating that is only dinged by the fact that some of the text is small, and for the most part I would agree with that. Obviously the text thing is going to be subjective, but for the most part you can get this running pretty well on the Steam Deck. The only caveat I really wanted to mention is that I don't know if it's just like the graphics or the specific effects they're using in this game, but on that smaller screen and the lower graphical settings that you're going to need to run it on that hardware, it looks kind of really grainy sometimes, especially at nighttime in the open world Detroit area. And this can make the images that you are seeing just like really unclear, even though that's kind of just the settings. And I didn't love that personally, not to mention that I can't aim like weapons on a controller like that to save my life. But if you really wanted to play this on the Steam Deck, you should be able to without too much of a hassle, which brings me to positives, negatives, and then we'll wrap this thing up. So on the positive side, it feels like a very over-the-top action movie, and it is a lot of fun, just churning through enemies, breaking down walls, picking up enemies, chucking them into each other, and you just feel like an absolute tank walking through these guys. I think the choices that they added to the story and how you can affect the outcome for the city was a lot of fun, even if it wasn't really necessary. And doing all of that via a surprising amount of side content, I think is some of the best stuff this game has going for it. And yet, on the negative side, a lot of the main missions especially feel like you are playing like an old arcade shooter where you are being moved automatically of the game's volition, and you're just kind of like shooting enemies as they pop up. A lot of those main missions in particular have that specific feeling. And while I think they did some fun things with it, it's hard to shake it once you notice it. There's also the fact that the boss fights are pretty lackluster, which is a bit of a bummer, and then there's things like those secondary weapons you can pick up that, while occasionally fun, especially in the earlier areas before you start getting your main weapon upgrades, ultimately kind of wind up being pointless. So there's that, which brings me to my conclusion. So I would say RoboCop Rogue City is an incredibly fun, like, AA experience. And with that in mind, it is currently $50 US over on Steam at max price. And if I'm being honest, is this a game I would have played for $50? No. But having bought it for $6 as part of an autumn sale, I had a lot of fun for that price, and I guess if you wanted to pay full price for this, it would really just come down to the things you prioritize. If you're just looking for that really fun shooter experience and you're not terribly concerned with it doing much else, you'll probably have a good time here. But either way, I think they did a really good job with it, and if the price is an issue for you, thankfully it's been out long enough that it is on sale pretty regularly. And it's definitely a fun kind of game to kill a weekend with. But I think that's pretty much all I've got to say for this particular review, so certainly hope you enjoyed it, this incredibly timely review, I might remind you. But by all means, certainly let me know how you feel about it down in the comments section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.